Hi, thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll begin in about 30 seconds. Hi, good morning everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this LNS Research broadcast, Keys to Successful New Product Introduction, Bridging the Digital Quality Divide. My name is Diane Murray, a Marketing and Research Associate with LNS Research, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you for joining us for the broadcast. And again, as always here at LNS, we recognize that we are not alone in our research endeavors, and we really attribute our success to the executives from manufacturing and other industrial companies that are actively engaged in our research projects with us, and of course, to all those who are members of LNS programs. But of course, we do thank today's sponsors for helping us bring this important research to you. I'd also like to take a few moments to cover the usual housekeeping items. First, for the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection and closing any programs or browser sessions you have running in the background. Today is a live webcast. It's being streamed through your computer, so there's no dial-up number. All of the audio is coming through your computer and the speakers. So for the best audio quality, please make sure that your speakers or your headset are turned on and that the volume is up so that you can hear our speaker today. Some networks and internet connections do cause the slides or the audio to advance slowly. So if you sense any delay in the slides or in the audio, simply click the refresh button on your browser or your browser tab to update the page, and that should catch you back up. At the bottom of your screen are application widgets. All of them are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can also expand the presentation area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. So if you see any images or graphs in the presentation that are a little too small for you, do go ahead and expand the presentation to maximum screen. Again, this is a live event, but due to the large number of guests, all lines are in listen-only mode. So we encourage you to actively participate by using that Q&A widget. You can submit your questions throughout the event. We will collect them up and we will present them to the speaker at the end during the Q&A session. We are recording this event, and so we will make it and the slides available for viewing early next week. You won't be able to download or view until next week, but we will send you an alert by email when the recording and the handouts are ready. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dan Jacob. He is a principal analyst with LNS. We're really pleased to have someone of Dan's caliber heading up our quality practice. He has more than 20 years experience in quality, reliability, risk, and safety across automotive, aerospace and defense, high-tech, electronics, medical device, and metals. Prior to joining our organization, Dan was responsible for quality solutions for companies like PTC and Relics. Before he started focusing on software and consulting, he spent time in the process development and technology group at Delphi Automotive. So Dan, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experience with us today.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks everyone for attending. I think we have an interesting discussion here today. We actually began this research about 9 months ago, so we actually got quite a bit of input on building out a new some new research surveys, etc., to capture some of the challenges for NPI in today's market, and we took a fairly novel approach. So I think one of the things that's really important for many manufacturers is obviously NPI success. We just recently had our executive roundtable on this topic, and the importance of NPI to corporate success is really is it's a very strong connection, with some manufacturers expecting more than 50% of new revenue coming from new MPIs in the next 12 to 18 months. So, and that number continues to grow. So it's really a substantially important area, strategically important for companies, and it's changed quite a bit here in the last several years of digital transformation. So there's a lot of traditional challenges we still face in MPI, but there's also a lot of new opportunities to really differentiate your organization, and we wanted to make sure we capture that. So the way we really attacked this was looking at it from a cross-functional perspective. MPI is an area that is highly reflective of your organization's culture, right? If you think about all the different teams engaged in NPI and the different disciplines and the strategic nature of the process itself, right? It's really a critical area to get right and to have the right culture, the right insights, and really to drive the right outcome for the organization. So we're going to get into that here today and kind of cover some of the again, some of the high-level topics here would be you're looking at some of the market dynamics that are impacting MPI, state of the market, how you can differentiate. So we've got several different sections in this presentation today to talk about differentiation, both from an overall MPI perspective as well as specifically around quality as well. So we dive into that a bit. And then we start talking about a new framework that LNS has launched with this research called the Digital Innovation Cycle. And this framework is something that really is critical to organizations in this new digitalized world. When you hear about disruption and innovation, it's really a critical concept, and this will help you understand how you can position your organizations more effectively and drive better outcomes. So with that said, let's start off with demographics. And before I get into demographics themselves, let's take a moment and get a perspective of those who are on the call today. So I've got a single question here for you. What is your role in the organization? And if you select that on this slide, when we get to the next slide, we'll review the data. So let me give you a second or two here to do that. Okay, great. So what's your role? And you can see that those on the call today, about a third of us in manufacturing operations, and then those who responded, again, compliance and product development, and also some dual roles here, obviously, with quality as well. So that's so quality, manufacturing operations, compliance, and product development. All right, great. So that'll help us, again, tune our discussion here a bit here today. So the data that went into the survey itself, or excuse me, the research, was a mix of data from our quality management survey, which is a long-running survey that captures best practices and capabilities of the market. It's taken us a while to pull this information together, as you can imagine, but over 1,350 executives responding to this survey, and you can see how that's geographically distributed by industry, and this is high-level batch discrete process. You can kind of see how that breaks out, as well as by revenue, which actually the revenue piece fairly well matches the market itself. So the way we define small, as you can see in this slide to the right, is from 0 to $250 million in revenue, annual revenue. Medium's $250 to $1 billion, and large is greater than $1 billion. So that's our definition of how we parse that data out. The NPI data itself, once we scrub the data, we're looking at 120 respondents and executives from, again, cross disciplines. You can see how this breaks out as well, almost in a very similar fashion to what we saw on the call here today. 42% are quality, 21% were product development, 12% operations, and then down from there. So you can see how that breaks out as well. Slightly larger percentage in medium, and that's kind of reflective of some of my contacts and the folks that ended up responding to that survey. But there's a number of other data points here as well that come from different resources that we've pulled together. So there's our general demographic surveys, our industrial Internet of Things survey and research, and our metrics that matter and analytics that matter research as well. that really drills into operations. So a number of perspectives that can really help shape the research and some of the findings. So let me drill into some of the mega trends that we see in NPI, and some of these aren't really that much of a surprise, but I think you need to see them all together to really understand how you need to respond to this. So first of all, if you look at globalization of the value chain, you can see some of our research on how important collaborating with complex supplier networks is, right? You see just how critical that is, and if you look at, for instance, I was invited out to speak at the Aircraft Engine Supplier Quality Forum from SAE at the end of last year. And in that session, a lot of work associated with you're trying to standardize the processes and expectations of the supply chain, and really to try to drive down, use that to help drive down defects. And it's a huge initiative and a lot of work being put into that, because if you look at the increase in flight hours, and flight time, and et cetera, if you extrapolate the data we see, the incident rate of engines and failures that we have today to 20 years from now, we'd be seeing failures every several weeks, catastrophic failures. So it's really critical to bring a highly safe and highly reliable and quality system, which is the aircraft engines, to bring that to the next level, which is extremely challenging, and it really involves the supply chain as well as the engine OEMs themselves. So that's one piece, but if you kind of drill in here as well, lots of focus around things like country and regions. If you look at regulatory submission, for instance, it's a big deal and changing quite a bit in the last several years. So if you identify that you have a product you want to submit into one country, and now that was the plan, and I hear this regularly, right? We develop a new product, we think that product's fantastic, and we had planned on launching it, let's say, in the U.S., and then we realized it's so good we want to launch it in many other places. So how do we actually respond to that? That creates a lot of challenges because you still need to go through the regulatory submission process. You need to resubmit so you can still access that market, et cetera. So lots of complexities here associated with globalization and both the supply chain and competition. And so when you look at some of the statistics from that survey that LNS has completed here around NPI, some of the objectives here, again, really point to these challenges that manufacturers face trying to defend their core markets against global competition, which can drive down the price. So, or things like, let's develop products that are better suited to different regions of the world, which drives different requirements at the beginning of the process, right? So lots of changes here, lots of complexity associated with the idea of, it's going to be great. Let's go global. We'll be able to drive more revenue. Of course, we've got competition coming to us. But, at the same time, you need to consider a lot of these factors as you're developing a product. Second piece is, obviously this trend we've seen for several years now around product and configuration complexity. The chart on the left-hand side is from the Defense Acquisition University, and I really like it. It shows that, as time goes on, as you develop a product, right, your costs you expend as you develop the product are low in the early phases, but you've committed a lot of those costs. So in terms of architecture of the product, maybe if we talk again about defense or highly mission critical systems, you'd have to have potentially redundancy in a specific architecture you're going to have in place, right? The information and lessons learned you use to decide that has a substantial impact. And again, those decisions are made early, but they impact your final suitability for the market. The same thing's true, obviously, in life sciences and general consumer market as well. So, I think one thing that is interesting is, again, this idea of just how complex this is, and how when you look at that supply chain, you look at complexity. It's not, sometimes it's really substantially around the product itself. It's around the configurability, so personalization of the product, or the many of the different variations you see out in the of the product that you need to manufacture, which impacts your manufacturing operations in your quality picture. But also is that supply chain, and you've got regulatory bodies like the FDA who are really also monitoring that very closely now with a blockchain initiative. So it's cross industries, and it's really not specific to just discrete. There's a lot of complexity, obviously in the operational side from a process perspective as well. Third, another key piece, again, we're looking at a lot of these different pieces in concert, right? So time to market pressure is obviously critical. The importance of being first to market really drives quite a bit of pressures for some. Now, obviously, that's not the case if you're build to print, right? But in cases where you own the IP and you're trying to launch that out there, and now let's think back a few slides and think about this global competition and the pace of innovation out there, right? From this growing pool of competitors in your space, right? So it's something that is really critical. And for certain product areas like science-rich products, again, life science-oriented, or autonomous vehicles, for instance, right? Those take quite a bit of time to develop and launch in such a way that they're going to be accepted by the market. But that actually means that, again, there's a lot of pressure on time to market, but lots of risks associated with potential failure. And so there's quite a bit of risk in this. There's a lot of new manufacturing processes that have been adopted and can reduce time to market by up to 30%. Things like your systems engineering and 3D modeling, additive manufacturing, etc. So a lot of this can help impact this, but it's obviously in concert with some of the other trends, really critical. But now the one last one, some of those things obviously have been underway for quite a while, but this last perspective is really for quality professionals, those are on the phone, that, again, we've got almost half that are quality, really a critical point of view. And for all those who care about quality, right, it's not just the quality department, it's really those who are, feel responsible or accountable for quality. This increased visibility in the market is a driver that is transforming industry. When we had the executive roundtable again a few weeks back, this discussion went on for over a half an hour about just the concerns and reactions that manufacturers that have consumer-facing brands are taking around this. And it's not even just in those areas, and we explored this from a supplier perspective as well. And if you look at EDI and automotive, for instance, and right, so you had a lot of the electronic data interchange between in the value chain, right? So you get more of that information flowing. The visibility of your customers, of your supplier, continues to increase over time, right? And things like, again, going back to regulated industries, the FDA has done a lot of work. That blockchain example is one where they're getting more insights, but also, the adverse events reporting system that FDA has launched here recently. Sure, that data was available before, but now you've got, it's being interpreted into dashboards that are, really providing that perspective on where a device manufacturers, where the problems are coming from, and really clear insights to anyone who's interested. It's publicly available, so it's anyone who's interested and concerned about maybe buying a specific product. Let's say it's a major your healthcare network that's looking to make acquisitions of products, right? It's that much easier to get into that information and use that as a part of your selection process. But one of the key things, again, is this idea around the online marketplaces and social media. It's really, that has, for anyone who is consumer-facing, or maybe you're not the OEM, but you're tier 1 to tier 2, your visibility into that and the importance of that to the marketplace, it's really provided. In the past, again, you go to the Better Business Bureau to try to pick up information about products, for instance, right? Or you go to Consumer Reports, and now you don't nearly so much, right? You typically would go to social media to look at some of the challenges that it's faced. But in practice, when you select a product online, I know one of the common practices is to review those 5-star ratings and also some of the qualitative information around that. And a lot of the brand organizations understand that and are using it to their competitive advantage. So it's really a critical piece. Anecdotally, and I think we're going to see more of this come surface over time, but anecdotally, some of the big brands are able to now clearly identify just how important, let's say, quality is directly to revenue. and use that around 5-star ratings. So it's some real advancements there. And I think for the quality professionals or for anyone who's, again, focused on quality, this really helps elevate the discussion. It really changes the discussion around from something that's maybe compliance oriented or around reduction in cost. Cost of quality is obviously really critical, but you're also now clearly able to demonstrate that quality in this new world directly influences consumer behavior. So all those things really, again, change the perspective and drive the importance of NPI. And so there are considerations, obviously, that require a change. So that I think the bottom line is you look at those scenarios there, you can't say, well, that's fine, and I'm going to continue to do it the way I was doing it, unless you've got extraordinarily good success criteria already, right? And for much of the market doesn't. And here's some of the MPI statistics. So let's give an overview. The way that we approach the research, again, was to start from the very top. Let's look at how successful MPI is. Let's look at some of how you define success, some of your top-level challenges, et cetera. And then we'll drive that down in and start looking at specific areas where you have your overlap between the between different teams, and again, examine some of that culture, and then decide what those takeaways are and how you can differentiate yourself. So if you look at the MPI statistics here, this shows top left. These are the quantity of NPIs delivered in a given year, right? And so the mean, is 25 NPIs a year of those surveyed. What percentage of those are successful that meet your success criteria, all of your primary success criteria? Well, it's only 56%, right? Percent of company personnel involved in MPI is 20 on average, 24% involved, and involved for the last chart there is saying that the general duration is 24 months. So 2 years, 24% of your company involved. You're doing this over 25 products on average a year, and your average success rate is 56%. Now, of course, that varies by industry, et cetera, but I think those underlying data points really help highlight that there's a lot going on here, but the process isn't working that well on average across the industry. And so, and when you look at that, by the way, I'd encourage you to look at the ebook as well if you haven't downloaded that already. It provides some additional statistics that this first chart section of our discussion today aren't going to cover. One of the areas is around NPI. What does NPI mean? What are the objectives you've got for NPI? So what does success mean? And it really comes back to things like building successful brands, driving revenue, so it ties back to business success, innovation, improved quality, retention of customers. So lots of that stuff is what is expected from NPI. And you can see in the chart on the left-hand side, these are your top challenges to achieving NPI success, right? And you see product validation being the top one, but it's really pretty widely distributed. It's not like any one thing's running away here, right? You've got that, you've got quality management, departmental silos, et cetera. Broadly, these are collaborative, cross-functional NPI, traditional challenges that we've seen in NPI for quite a while, right? A lot of these silos and technology gaps and ineffective change management, all these things really have been around for a while and still are lingering here for us that are causing us substantial problems. So let's explore some of these other areas. So look at the top 3 objectives by discipline. So what are different disciplines? I mentioned we took a cross-functional approach. What are people trying to accomplish? If you look at operations, product development, and product management, we bundled those together when we reported the data out. And quality and compliance. You can see that product quality really is a highlighted area. It stands out. You can see, obviously other areas as well. So manufacturing agility and et cetera. There's a long list of other objectives that sort of follow this, but the top ones really are around your quality, and that's across these different areas. So when you're looking to drive change for your organization, one of the things that that you can, in general, align around is quality, and that's really important because when you're trying to drive your cultural changes, it's really a critical piece. So one of our first keys we wanted to highlight to you is to establish strategic alignment across disciplines. So making sure that the multiple disciplines are really aligned in terms of what their expectations are for NPI. Start from a strategy perspective and what are the the top strategic objectives and metrics for your company. And as those, the typical, again, this would be the things that many companies practice, right? There's different approaches out there around how you do strategic planning, but ensuring that that's very closely connected in NPI, so that you're looking at metric performance and you're working together in a common goal. One area, again, that seems like it correlates very well across these different rules is around quality. So that's key number one. So secondly, we talked about how a lot of the challenges we faced that we identified were around collaboration and some of the traditional challenges in NPI. And if you look at down below on the left-hand side is some of the common challenges by discipline. So this kind of broke out the different phases of NPI, different phases that we selected, requirements planning, risk, new product test, supplier management, production planning, so these different activities that are performed, right? Excuse me. And then let's look at challenges up above. So engage too late, disparate systems and data sources, and no consistent or formal process really bubbled to the top. Across those different areas, again, lots of data behind this, but these areas really bubbled to the top, and we're consistently challenges across these different areas. So if you're trying to tackle something in your organization, really looking at things like establishing formal processes, eliminating, consolidating systems and data sources. Obviously, those are critical pieces. Engage too late is a challenge, and it's also a bit of an outcome, right? So when you look at having the processes and the fragmented data, those obviously have a connection and help drive this late engagement. And why is late engagement important? We know it's inconvenient, but it's not just inconvenient, right? If you look on the right-hand side, this explores just one of those areas. It looks at the negative impact of those challenges just associated with requirements planning, right? And for those who had once you have those challenges, what's the negative impacts you've seen, right? And these are the statistics. Delayed launch and low initial volume, we didn't meet our costs, so we increased costs. We missed the market. That's reduced commercial viability. We lower initial quality. So those things really stand out. And if you look at how do you define successful new product introduction? Well, the top four things in there are time to market, project cost, quality, and product performance, right? So you're missing at least several of these based off that one challenge. So right there, that would be a reason why you'd see a decrease in an NPI success. So the second takeaway here is that you want to collaborate, right? So invest in technologies and the processes. Obviously, those two things really are important to kind of tie together. So you have, especially for larger organizations, right? So the idea of having processes and automating them and gathering the data so you can act upon that data and have multiple stakeholders engaged, obviously critical pieces here. Now, the third key is going to take us a minute. I want to kind of take you through some data and some frameworks. These have all been things that LNS have built out over time, and I want to give you this perspective before we show you the third key. So the first element I want you to get exposed to is this idea around your digital transformation strategy. So very quickly, if you look at the industrial Internet of Things, IIoT, right? If you look at Industry 4.0, digital transformation, to a large extent, they talk about something very similar, which is this idea of improved connectivity of data, inexpensive sensors that are being proliferated through manufacturing assets and through fielded systems, right? New technologies such as augmented reality, et cetera, that let you, in mobile applications, that let you consume that data in new fashions, right? And do it in the moment, where you're at and in context of maybe what you're looking at and what you're interfacing with. So, quite a bit of change here around this area, and you can read more about that from LNS and other sources. But here's the digital transformation strategy. You look at the how you build this thing. You start off with that strategic objectives, and that should look familiar to you from some of our recommendations from earlier. I'll say firsthand, worked with a number of manufacturers on this topic. This piece is very critical. When you get this right, it directly helps gain alignment from the top level on just how important some of these activities might be. So, critical element. And lets you set the stage for a journey instead of, really trying to do something tactical. And I think based on the data you just saw, this is going to take a little time to really truly address MPI effectively. Secondly, the operational excellence, so looking at people, process, and technology elements, and we'll talk about that, really explore that in more detail. And then finally, the third element I want us to focus on is this idea around operational architecture. And when we talk about, I mentioned earlier, the connectivity piece and the data, et cetera, well, this is kind of part of that building the bridge for quality, right? So looking at the shop floor and operations and service, right, and in-service components, and all that data on the operational side, and then all the data that's on the traditional IT side, so the systems you have in place that would govern maybe your product development process, right? So how do you connect that stuff so you can continue to drive ever better systems? So that's the first piece I want to really start off with, is what LNS calls operational architecture, which is you're taking the idea of enterprise architecture, which is something IT's been doing for a long time, that discipline, and extending that between IT and OT, so you can have a consolidated approach. Where OT, again, you kind of see that definition, machinery, et cetera. And that's, the operational side. This really looks specifically at the shop floor, but also think about service and in-service components. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the ISA 95 framework, really very, you don't need to worry about the details if you're not familiar or comfortable with that idea, but lots of research that LNS has around this as well. This looks at, really takes a temporal, time-based perspective on data. So you look at, levels 0 through 2. These are the assets themselves. So, the physical equipment, the sensors used to measure what's happening to the physical equipment, the controls directly on that piece of equipment. And then you look at level 3, which is smart connected operations. Often you think about this as a manufacturing execution system, right? This would be your production, quality, inventory, et cetera, trucking, all that stuff. And then you come up here to level 4, which would be the business systems like your PLM and EQMS, et cetera, right? So there's that, and then the final level above that LNS added to this framework is the idea of governance and planning, and that's looking at all the processes and how like ISO 9001 with the updates, right, and all the other update changes that you need to reflect in your organization. So looking at these elements and understanding how the operational data blends with the IT data to drive a change. So here's a deeper dive into that of that model. You can see suppliers, operations, customers and products, edge devices and analytics and sensors, et cetera. All that comes together in a connectivity and data model. You use that with data lakes and databases and data historians, and then so you're collecting that data in an integrated model. You're driving apps that help consume that and perform analytics on it, and let people, again, give the people involved perspectives and again, get visibility to that, and also have that integrated in with the processes and collaborate around that information. So it's quite a this is an undertaking, but getting this data connected is really the again, some of that OT and IT connectivity. And one piece I wanted to highlight around this, which has been a transformational factor here for manufacturers, and it's for those of especially with connected products, for instance, but the idea of having a digital twin, which is a digital counterpart to the physical part that's being manufactured or the part that's in service, right? And if you look at all those inputs. We just looked at that model a moment ago and all the connection points there, right? And this is where in the digital twin, it takes all those inputs. It can bidirectionally connect and drive data back out to maybe improve things like, the workflow processes and the operational flow and maintenance activities, right? As well as the quality of the product. And so it can do that in the moment, but that information is also extremely strategically important in NPI. So that's where you can also use it to overlay simulations to improve your simulations. Okay, we can actually see if you've got a connected product, here's the data, here's how that product's being used in the field, right? And now we can use that information to drive new insights while we're defining what the use cases are, what the requirements are, and specifications on specific parts and how it's going to perform against parts that are specified in a certain fashion. So all that stuff connects together, right? And you can drive, as you take this data around the digital data, that's where you can overlap it with things like, again, augmented reality and simulation, et cetera. Lots of applications in this area, and it's one I want to make sure you're aware of. One specific use case we've been seeing growing in an increasing fashion, and again, this would be specifically more on the operations and quality space, is the idea of zero defect initiatives. And we have a number of manufacturers who have been working with around this topic. And you're taking the traditional data and this digital data, so your manufacturing operations data and control plans, right, and your process FMEAs and all that kind of good stuff, your inspections and defect data, and now also overlapping with that, all the data you're gathering from the equipment, shop floor equipment, right? And also your warranty data maybe, and that social media data we talked about earlier. So you can look at how you manufactured this thing and compare it to what's happening out in the field, and use that in a number of different ways. One way is to do 100% inspection of all of the parts, because now you can take that information and use it to assess the quality and suitability of a given product based off of a lot of the information you have, and really adding a layer of insight there. The second one is if we can compare what happened while we were making the product, and we can look at that given serial number out in the field and understand what warranty issues we may have had with it, et cetera. We can take that information back now and look in manufacturing and understand how we can predict that in the future. Because that part, we didn't put it in the field because we didn't think it was going to work, right? But we all have warranty challenges when you're manufacturing things. So how do we take that new knowledge and use it with our sensor data to predict which parts may fail even though they've passed our inspections. And a number of manufacturers working on that and getting really pretty astounding results around this area. And it's continued to build and expand on that. It's impacting service, et cetera. So lots of impact here. So the third key, we kind of talked through some of that stuff. I wanted to give you some exposure there. The third key is digitalizing, right? And that's where, again, the market's really moving rapidly in this direction. Our statistics show that. When we first started tracking this back in 4 years ago, very few were moving on this path, and most didn't have an awareness of it. But as we moved along the journey here, over the last several years, it hasn't taken long, right? Now you're looking at, it's almost 50% that either have something, it's 53% actually, they either have something in place or have something they're planning on doing digital transformation in the next, some sort of digital transformation in the next 12 months. So it's grown substantially. And so what you need to think about again is this idea of looking at, do you have the traditional stuff in place? And we talked about how important that is, right? So your EQMS and CRM and PLM, et cetera, do you have that in place? And then building upon that to add more value. I'll even go back quickly and talk about that last use case we talked about with zero defects. We've seen a number of manufacturers who are going down that path, and when they start deploying it, they don't necessarily have the traditional data in place. They don't the processes aren't as repeatable as they should be. And when they go to perform the analytics, they get coin toss results, and it's really not adding value until they go back and firm up the traditional now they can generate excellent results that guide activity. So it's think about that stuff, right? So it's the traditional, and then building upon that. You can see the image on the left-hand side, the Quality 4.0 image that we have that really, I think, tells this picture so effectively, that tells that story where you've got traditional quality, and Quality 4.0 builds upon it. Definitely does not replace it, but it builds upon it. And you think about those 11 elements around the outside of Quality 4.0 and how that really drives, the concepts around connectivity, data analytics, apps, etc. How that really drives an impact. So, with that, how can we give you some takeaways here from an outcome standpoint? The first is, let's look at two specific practices. The first practice is product portfolio management with configurations, right, with configuration management. And, product portfolio management is the first best practice. And the second is configuration and change managed requirements. Okay, so for those who have adopted neither, you can see what their OEE, on-time delivery, first pass yield, and cost of poor quality were. If you adopted one of those two, here's the median results in the middle. And if you adopted both, you can see on the right-hand side, you can see how that trends up as you go through this, where it should go up, and it goes down where it should go down. So you look at that, cost of poor quality, what a highlight for you that's in percent revenue. So that's 10% of revenue going to cost of poor quality on the left-hand side and 3% on the right. That directly hits your operating income. So after the call, look up your operating income, right? And understand, okay, maybe your operating income is 12.5%. If you added 7% to that, that'd be a huge impact on your organization. So that's one, right? And that really speaks to that idea of really having the processes in control and connected in the organization. And then the second piece is really looking at the cross-functional elements, right? So cross-functional requirements validation and in other areas. So we talked about the second key being collaboration, right? And this really hits on that. You can see all these different technology, process, team, metrics-based collaboration elements here, and those who either didn't adopt it or did adopt it in the improvement. That's all in percent successful NPI, okay? So if you look at the very top one, EQMS and MOM integration, those who didn't have it had a median adoption, percent NPI success of 66%. Those who did adopt it at 80%. Right, and that's results in a 21% improvement in MPI success, and we talked about how costly and valuable that process is. So obviously, a critical point requires you to have EQMS and MOM in place, but you tie those things together, helps drive outcomes, as an example. Okay, so specifically around the Quality Leaders Playbook, there's 5 elements, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. The first is overcoming traditional quality challenges. This looks at, we're reported on this for a long time. We have done a lot of research around this and how to approach it. And if you look at the roadblocks to engaging quality in new product introduction, early in new product introduction, so that's what quality leaders want, right? We want that culture of quality, and we want to have early engagement. So you can see where this is coming from. There's a lot of these challenges around processes adding complexity and delay, being too time consuming to support with current staffing level, et cetera. So a lot of these long-standing challenges we've had around culture, harmonization, and technology are really driving the roadblocks to earlier engagement. Data are among the leading challenges. And the second one is allocating sufficient resources to NPI. This is one that, when I'm talking to VPs of quality, very critical. Lots of work out there. It's probably too late in the year for you to adapt to this right now, but when you go and start doing your strategic planning for next year, you're looking at the right alignment between NPI and your quality teams. If your quality teams are predominantly aligned with manufacturing operations, you're going to get, and you can go proactive. You've got your team as a reactive team. So look at how you've got that lined up. You can see how this really drives. We've got a lot of data around this element too. It's, you look at median of 5% of quality resources are dedicated to NPI. So it's in general, it's light, but there are those out there that have in excess of 20% tied to NPI. They're really trying to get their arms around this and really getting engaged early in the process. So really important elements here for sure. Invest in risk management, risk data management. So this is a third piece. If you actually start on the chart on the right-hand side, I know it feels a little backwards, but critical capabilities for NPI success. This looked at a lot of the pieces. I mean, these came from, again, really good assessment of what typically drives success in NPI. Management gate review, big one. For some manufacturers, this is so critical. You look at, do you have a cross-functional team at management gates, and can that cross-functional team, do they have go, no-go authority and hold the budget strings, right, the purse strings? And it's, some really have that, and it gives all voting members some substantial teeth in NPI. But even above that, there's, risk analysis and risk management. So that's, really a critical element that the market sees around critical capabilities for NPI success. And if you look over on the left-hand side, it's a lot of these traditional things around actually quite a bit around data. And I'd say that one of our problems in risk management, I like the idea of risk-based thinking. I don't want to undermine that. But what I do find is that we often address risk in a style that hasn't changed fundamentally since the 70s. I know we've added processes, we've changed how the processes operate, et cetera. So to a certain extent that's not true, but if you look at how we get feedback and how you have standardization and the centralized risk framework elements, right? The way it's actually being performed, if we're still doing it in spreadsheets, I mean, you could be doing that on a piece of paper, right? And it all depends upon do you have the right people in the room? Well, a product isn't inherently less risky because Angela, who really understands our manufacturing operations in Mexico, wasn't on the call that day, right? We need to have a much better data-centric approach to this. And I think just thinking about it's not sufficient. And just having it built into the thinking, wow, that's extremely valuable, and we should definitely be doing that. You need to have an approach to establish a baseline and then drive continuous improvement. And I think that's an area that we haven't prioritized enough. Build on strengths. So this is another key piece here, right? So NPI practices, what are the strengths for quality? And I think this is one of the things I want to highlight is that quality in general has a very strong process approach, right? So defining processes, defining metrics to measure success, right? And I think those disciplines are extremely valuable in improving NPI. I think just looking at it, look at the top bullet point I have here on the right-hand side, talking about how 23% of the market has no MPI standardization, and another quarter of it is standardized at the site or plant level. Now, that can make sense, but it makes it really different. Think about your competencies and how you're going to shift people from one plant to another if that's necessary, right? How you're going to make comparisons between different areas and understand outliers, right? It does make sense where you would have variation if you've got medical devices, aerospace, and consumer products, right? Variation makes sense, but having an overarching plan is really critical so you can have things, you can really start driving good outcomes here and consistent lessons learned. So a few different things. On the top left, the NPI practices adopted enterprise-wide, light adoption there. These are all things we would feel really should be in place, but are lightly adopted across the enterprise. Secondly, quality data is the most broadly used set of data for lessons learned. That's a strength, adds a lot of value. If you're doing and it makes sense, right? Quality touches the whole operation in the entire life cycle. That data is extraordinarily valuable. If you want to talk about how to improve the value of quality to organizations, that's a strong point you can start from to really drive outcomes. And then finally, the cross-functional accountability already exists. One of the things we captured in the research was really the RACI model. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but responsibility. Are you responsible for tasks? Are you accountable for meeting quality expectations? Are you consulted by others when you help complete quality tasks? Or are you just really and then you get pulled in when absolutely necessary, right? Accountable is the highest level, and followed by responsible, right? So you can see on the left-hand side, we've got IT, operations, product development, and quality. And you can see obviously accountability is very high on quality, but you can also see that's quite high in product development and operations, right? If you look at responsibility, it's quite high as well in those areas. So between 50 and 60% of those areas feel either accountable or responsible for quality, the quality of the product. Critical points, right? And so when we talk about it, sometimes quality leaders, see that as, okay, that's great, but when the rubber meets the road, what are the actions taken? But I think you still need to work that. That's a strong point that you have, and now build out, how you're going to leverage that to ensure the right steps are taken. So go back to thinking about some of the challenges we looked at, like being engaged earlier. Make sure the processes are streamlined, that you're kind of making it more accessible, maybe dropping the competency threshold so you can make it easier for others to get engaged, but they engage effectively. So really take some process engineering work, as well as obviously the data being a critical piece here. And then finally, we talked about Quality 4.0 and innovation. This is a key piece. And we've already talked about it, so I'm going to kind of move through this quickly. But for quality leaders, that's your playbook, those 5 elements. And finally, and there's so much to cover here. We actually have quite a bit of research we're not going to get into. But one of the things that I wanted to really highlight is that we did quite a bit of work around the idea of innovation and disruption in this research as well. So when you look at the market, and disruptions have been a term that we've been thrown around for the last couple of years, and there's some really meaningful examples that are in the market that we've seen, right, around disruption. Innovation is prized and is one of the top 4 objectives for NPI success. So very important elements. So how do you really do this, right? Because it's kind of a fuzzy idea, right? Disruption and innovation. And so what LNS did was we pulled together this digital innovation cycle to really put it in perspective and help you understand how to act upon, really first start with the insights themselves, right? So there's the insights, as you can see on the left-hand side, but there's a lot of different insights that we have in place. We've had insights for a long time. There's a lot of ambiguity that we need to recognize, so the uncertainty around insights, right? Those then move over to, you use those insights to adapt to the market. And so that requires quite a bit. We'll talk about that here in a moment. And then you decide, and then you act, and then that aligns with outcomes, and hopefully those outcomes are in line with what we expected them to do. So if we look at this, overall, it's a decision-making cycle, right? So you have this decision-making cycle can apply at both a high level for NPI itself and for early requirements, but it can also apply deeper down in specific maybe tasks or other areas, right? So as you're executing tasks and as you're making decisions throughout the NPI process, this also applies within those areas as well. I think one of the key things about this also is that it's focused on the idea of using the insights and adapting, but really one of the key points to this also is the idea of tempo, right? In part, this was informed by some frameworks that have been in place for a while that came from the military. And so if you look at them, they're really focused around the idea of having high levels of agility and be able to react to different changes and do them in such a way that it keeps your opponent off balance. And it's very much what we see when you look at disruption and innovation into the market, right? It's that it's off tempo and it can drive substantial change in the market because maybe it's faster, but it also aligns from a timing perspective. So it's really a matter of timing. Another point is that this doesn't replace your NPI method of choice. So you might be using systems engineering, or agile approach. You could be using phase gate There's lots of different NPI approaches. This does not have to replace any of those. It really fits with whatever approach you're taking, but really a way of emphasizing the importance of the decision-making process and the inputs into that. And so it also looks at both traditional and digitalized practices, and I think that's another key piece. So to kind of quickly cover this, because we're running short on time now, it's let's look at the insights and ambiguity element. So uncertainty is always there. If you look at the fuzzy front end of the process, of the NPI process, where we're trying to assess market requirements and what the opportunities are, there's always uncertainty in NPI. But how much, where is this coming from? Where can we get less ambiguous insights, right? Very clear insights, and that's where a lot of in a lot of cases, the digitalized data really helps us get deeper, new insights, and can give it to us with a higher velocity. Let's look at the benchmarking element here. For instance, if you benchmark competition, it can take you quite a while to execute those benchmarks, but as soon as you complete it, you're likely out of date, and then there's new competitors in place, right? But if you can go and gather data, again, from social and online marketplaces, that can obviously, with the right levels of analytics, et cetera, can provide much deeper insights in terms of how the market reacts to those products, at least, right? And then as you add in your sensors, et cetera, maybe on that product, you can start gaining some insights on some more of the detailed engineering level inputs. So that's one element. The second is around adaptation. And quickly, underneath the adapt circle here, you've got analysis, which is where you do that, really decompose the data. Synthesis, which is where you'd form new concepts around that analysis work. You need to have the idea of a culture of change. So many people can be exposed to certain inputs, but struggle to adapt to those inputs because the culture isn't in place, and there's not a culture that can really adapt to those differences. And maybe that culture is we've always done it this way, right? You need to have that culture and change in place. The mutual trust element as well is another key element. Actually, the Xbox leadership pointed to this relatively recently about how there was a gap in mutual trust between leadership and the execution teams, the engineering teams, et cetera. And it resulted in Xbox missing the market and really struggling against its competition. So that's one example, but there's many out there. Collective stakeholder engagement, which we've talked about, competency, which is critical. There's always, I think competency is really important because you think about the fact that there's always going to be ambiguity, right? If you have competency, if you have knowledge, you can really still drive highly valuable, innovative insights based on much less data. So there's always that human element that drives the importance there. Collaboration between the team members, and then that's all that a mix of traditional and digitalized. That information, those apply regardless. And then you have the IoT insights from above. So that information from the digital twin that you're getting, machine learning and artificial intelligence, connected worker information, new apps, all that kind of good stuff. That adds a lot more input that can be used to adapt. But you still need to get these things down below, right? It's not just as simple as having the data, but the data adds, again, much less ambiguous inputs. And then you get down here to deciding and acting. So deciding is your test and compare, looking at your tempo that we talked about, actually committing to a decision, and risk tolerance. So I think risk tolerance is important because not all organizations are really want to be innovators. They might want to be a fast follower. You've got to make that decision, right? And that's, again, you've got a lot of the IoT insights. And then finally, from an acting perspective, this is where you're driving with your competencies, process, procedures, and work standards, as well as the new insights, but looking at disruption, which is you're disturbing the market. So how do you act quickly, act effectively, and drive the right outcomes? And that's really a critical element. And this is where extending some of the new digital knowledge to the actors themselves is obviously a critical piece to help drive improvement. And this is the overall cycle. It shows the feedback loops, the individual elements, et cetera. I think you've got that is a really valuable tool to help assess your organization and help drive innovation and disruption. So with that said, here are the takeaways for you. To kind of summarize, there's quite a bit to be covered there. The first is to differentiate your MPI, look at strategic, collaborative, and digitalized MPI. We saw some of the outcomes of that earlier. Bridging the quality divide. These are the 5 elements that we looked at as well. And then assess your company against a digital innovation cycle and use that tool to help drive organizational change and data change. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
Dan, thank you so much. Covered quite a lot of ground today. We have already reached the top of the hour, so we are not really going to have time to handle the many Q&A, the many questions that came in today. Dan, if that's all right with you, we're going to cover that in our blog tomorrow. Would that be all right with you?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Sounds good. So look for that tomorrow. We will we'll publish the questions there.
Yeah. So I'd like to remind everyone that the event has been recorded. We'll send you an email early next week with a link to access both the slides and the on-demand recording. We will cover the Q&A. There's a lot of questions that have come in. We're going to cover those in tomorrow's blog post from Dan. I'd also like to thank today's sponsors. They are IQS, a Cordy company, Siemens, and Viva. So please do show your appreciation for our sponsors today by visiting their websites and finding out how they can help you in your digital transformation journey. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful day.